glad to have you with us this evening. I'm inside the Rockwood Baptist Church. It's a beautiful building, as you can kind of take a look and see, like that. It really is just really lovely and large, and in a neighborhood that's surrounded by homes and people. And 1990, this church averaged about 300 in attendance. In the early 1980s, I was the youth pastor here, and they had a bus ministry and well over 300 in attendance. This church has sent out missionaries. It planted churches. In fact, even though the church here has ceased to exist, we just encountered a wonderful Haitian congregation that shares this building, and there's also a Samoan congregation. Those two congregations still meet in here, but neither one of them are able in any way to absorb the cost of this building in terms of running it, keeping it up. Even in this sanctuary, while it's a beautiful sanctuary, there's no air conditioning. The air conditioning units haven't worked for quite a while, and the windows don't open. So we're all sweating right now, but we're in here. So anyway, I was the youth pastor here back in the early 1980s, and it was a great church that did a lot of great ministry and some wonderful people and helped shape my life in many ways. But like so many churches in what we call the inner suburban ring, okay? That's the suburbs that were the growing suburbs after the Second World War in the 1950s and 60s, but then the growth passed them by. And the schools changed, and the neighborhoods changed, and what was once a very homogeneous neighborhood has become a very complex neighborhood to try to figure out. It's in that inner suburban ring where the majority of our churches in metro areas close their doors. And boy, this church is smack dab in what we call an inner suburban ring. And back in the 50s and 60s, this was a fast growing area of new homes and young families. And now it's no longer. It's still an area of a lot of people. It's not like it's the houses haven't been torn down and there's not industry all around, but it's a very different kind of neighborhood than it was when this church was at its height and built this building and a large education space as well next door. So how do these churches die? Well, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a long process of many decisions. At the time, the decisions sort of seem like they make sense because they sort of keep people happy. They keep people there. We don't lose anybody else. Listen, when you are making decisions in your church based on not losing members, that is the death wheeze of a church. You do not make decisions based on not losing members. You say, well, we got to care about our members and take care of them and love them. Absolutely. But you make decisions based on the people you have yet to reach and the people who need the gospel. So in the last few weeks, we've been looking at several different reasons churches close. And I'm going to look at two real quick tonight. The first one is an over-reliance on programs. Now, this church, like many, I'm not picking this one out, I'm not singling this one out, please. Like many Southern Baptist churches that grew tremendously in the 1950s and 60s and even into the 70s, it was a program-based church. I mean, there was a program for everything, right? And you had Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, you had youth programs, a children's program, and choir programs. Everything was a program. We were very program-oriented people. And really, a lot of the leadership in those years was the greatest generation, men and women who'd gone through, as children, the Depression, and then as young adults, the Second World War, and then coming back in the 1950s, and they worked for General Motors, they worked for TWA, and the idea of following a program, following rules, putting a plan into place, all that really made sense. And so for one particular portion of the population, Southern Baptists did really well with all the program-based entities. The problem is that the world changed, and programs are they can be great, but they are not terribly flexible. Once you get a program in place in a church, you just try to remove it, all right? It can be the most dysfunctional waste of time in the world, but I promise you, somebody there loves that program. Somebody there is finding real validity in running that program and being part of that program. And we can't quit this program. We've got to keep doing this program. And so we have all these programs running that aren't really affecting the neighborhood or the community. And then we add programs because our church is dying. So what do? We grab some more programs. We go to a conference here. We see something there. We bring somebody in. We add this program. We add that program. And before you know it, we got programs coming out our ears. And the church is declining. And then we can blame the program. All right? Well, this program just doesn't work like it used to. We just got to find the right program. And here's the reality. You have to redefine success. I mean, success cannot simply be more people in this building this year than last year, because that can't go on indefinitely. I mean, just do the math, right? Success has to be, are we seeing a pattern of making disciples that make disciples that result in the community being noticeably better and lives being transformed. And if we're not seeing that, then we don't need to be doing the programs we're doing. If the programs we're doing are not creating disciples of Jesus who can create disciples, and are not impacting the immediate neighborhood where this church is, and seeing people come to know Jesus and become like him, then we don't need to do the program. It may be fun, it may be enjoyable. I mean, it's kind of like, you may have a soccer player that everybody loves. He's just a great guy in the locker room. Everybody thinks he's fun to hang out with. He tells great stories. He never breaks the rules. He runs real hard. He plays, but he never puts the ball in the net. Well, eventually, you got to find somebody who can put the ball in the net. We got to know what putting the ball in the net is. And we're not just pulling something out of the air here. The New Testament, Jesus makes it clear. He wants us to make disciples, to teach them everything to observe everything that I've taught you. And because they are disciples, right? Because we're a disciple of Jesus, then the neighborhood in which we live, in which we exist, should be noticeably better because we're living like Jesus. That's our metric of success, not having 20 more than we did last year or 40 more than we did last year. That's fine, but are we making disciples that make disciples, and are we truly impacting the community? And so we look for programs. And often I'll be with a church that's about to close its doors, and I'll say, what would you like to have? And they'll say, well, we don't have any youth. Okay, so tell me about that. Well, we used to have youth. And sure enough, this church used to have youth. See this choir loft right here? I mean, I used to drive the bus on Sunday nights, and I'd go down to mobile home parks down here, and I'd fill up that bus on Sunday night with teenagers, and we'd have a youth choir on Sunday night. And, so people look at that and they go, hey, we used to have a youth choir. We used to have a youth program. We need to have a youth program again. Okay, well, what's that look like? And generally in a dying church, they say, well, it would look like maybe somebody from the seminary coming in, starting a youth program, or a stronger church bringing over a youth leader. Here's the reality, all right? The last thing a dying church needs is a youth program. It needs the remaining members in that church to fall deeply in love with the teenagers, no matter how dysfunctional they are in their immediate neighborhood, and to care for them and to pray for them and try to get to know their names and try to engage them. You see, a program doesn't make me change my heart and my agenda. And so I'm going to bring in a youth program, and if it doesn't work, I can blame the youth program, and I can feel good about myself because we tried this youth program. No, have you tried loving the teenagers in your neighborhood who don't talk like you do, who don't think like you do, who don't dress like you do, but who need Jesus? See, that's the difference between a program. You need programs, but they're not the pathway to change your heart. They're not the pathway to reach a neighborhood. They may be necessary. They may be on-ramps. They may be scaffolding, but they're not the reason you're here. And churches have an over-reliance on programs. And when you over-rely on program, are you ready? You under-rely on the Holy Spirit. When you over-rely on programs, you under-rely on the Holy Spirit. We rely on ourselves or on what this program can do. And we say all the time, Jesus knows what he wants to do with every church. We just need to ask him, and then, this is the most important part, we need to listen to him, and then we need to do it. And so sometimes when we're so busy with programs, we don't have time to ask him or to listen. And I think sometimes the best thing we can do is just clear out all the programs and don't do anything but pray for 3 or 4 months. Just come together and pray and say, we're gonna take everything off the table, and we're going to see what would Jesus have us to do to make disciples and to see this community transformed. And we'll do those things. But even the programs you do, man, they're flexible. They're not here forever. And if they're not working and they're not reaching people and they're not making disciples, then move on. Don't be committed to the program. Be committed to the gospel and to Christ and to his plan. Again, people would rather spend time in our flesh. The adversary would rather have us spend time reading about programs, studying programs, working programs, than he would having us spend time in the Word of God, repenting of our sin, seeking the face of Jesus, asking him what he would have us to do. If you do that first, then there may be some programs that can help you accomplish some things, but don't get the cart before the horse. The other issue is, that's the first one, churches over-reliance on programs. The second one we're going to talk about real quick is the church ceases to become a vital part of the community. Now, again, this church is like so many churches in the inner suburban ring. When it was hitting on all cylinders, it built its first building, its second building, its biggest building. And by the way, that's what churches always do, right? They get to a certain size, the biggest they ever were. They go, oh, well, now we got to build a building that's 30% bigger than our biggest attendance ever. And then the day they finish it, they don't fill it up, and then they never fill it up. And in many ways, in our neighborhoods, our churches aren't too small. Our buildings are just too big. So if you got a building that seats 500 or 600 like this one does, and you have 200 in worship, you feel like 400 people didn't show up today. I mean, it's a very difficult. And so we built these buildings sometimes way too big, but we built them when the neighborhood was just hitting on all cylinders. But here's the reality. If you're going to go to any place anymore, even the rural areas, but especially in the cities, especially in these inner suburban rings, you've got to be ready and willing to understand these communities are going to change and turn over. They're going to churn constantly. It's going to be like you're pastoring a parade. I mean, people do not necessarily stay here. They don't necessarily come on here, buy a house a few blocks away when they first get married, and they retire here. That's not going to happen. A lot of the houses now are rental houses. They've turned them into duplexes. They're first homes. People come, they go. Some of the people who live around here now, rather than necessarily the majority of them, this is their main job, their first job, and they're starting their career. Some of them are in real chaos in their lives, and they have some real transitions going on in their lives and high needs in their lives. So all of that changes. And so while at one time the church might have been very much a part of the fabric of the community, as the community changed, church didn't quite understand how to adapt to that change. Now, let me say this really passionately. I'm not saying that the people in our churches don't love the neighborhood. They do love the neighborhood. Listen to what I'm saying. They just don't know how to love the neighborhood, all right? They don't know how to do it. I was at a church not too long ago for a while as helping them transition, and across the street from them was a halfway house, and up and down the streets from them were some people whose lives were really just a total chaotic mess. But 40 years ago, that neighborhood was a very established, very stable neighborhood with families. And so now that the neighborhood's changed, the church doesn't quite know how to reach these new people that have some real chaos in their life and real dysfunction in their life. They give them food every week. They give them clothing. They love on them. And here's what happens. When they show up on Sunday morning, then the remaining members of that church greet them and love them and put their arms around them and thank them that they're here at church. They always make them feel welcome. But the only thing they really know to say to those people is, oh, we hope you come back next week. That's not enough. For people whose lives are in chaos, people who are addicted to drugs and alcohol, people who are battling all kinds of conflicts in their lives and who need help, just saying, man, we hope you come back next Sunday isn't enough. You've got to create on-ramps to people. You've got to, like the Good Samaritan, you've got to stop, bend down, and get your hands dirty. You've got to spend time with them. You've got to put them up on your own donkey and carry them to the inn. You've got to spend the night with them. You've got to spend your own money, and even money you don't have yet. Whatever they need, we'll pay for it. And the truth of the matter is, for many of our churches, they look at all the needs these people have in these neighborhoods, and they go, we can't do this. We just can't. And they sort of just shut down, and the church that once was very much a part of the fabric of the neighborhood ceases to be. What it is we just drive into the church, we park our cars in the parking lot, we come inside, we do our church things, we get back in our cars, and we go home. And as far as this immediate neighborhood is concerned, we have very little impact. Now, we may, a couple times a year, pass out food or have a bounce house or a snow cone or two and have a party. But then you've heard me say before, oftentimes what people say is, well, we had these block parties and nobody came to church on Sunday morning. Well, of course not, because they want a moonwalk and a snow cone. They don't want to come to church on Sunday morning. And you don't have a block party to get the people in your neighborhood into your building. You have a block party to get the people who are in your building into the lives of the people in the neighborhood. And if the church isn't going to reach the neighborhood, it really doesn't need to be here. There are enough regional churches in our cities that have great youth groups and great choirs and great preaching that evangelical Christians can drive to and be part of that. A church in a neighborhood needs to be there for the neighborhood. And if you're not for the neighborhood, you probably don't need to be there. And frankly, I think Jesus wants you for the neighborhood. And if you don't embrace that neighborhood, then I believe he removes the candlestick. There's only one place in all the New Testament where the death of a church is spoken of. Paul doesn't talk about it. John doesn't talk about it. Peter doesn't talk about it. Jesus talks about it. He basically says, either do what I say or I'll remove your lampstand. And what he has said is make disciples. And if we don't do that, and we don't transform our neighborhood, we don't reach this. Look, the people who live around this church, the people who live around your church are not there by accident. They're not there because the economy changed, the housing situation's changed. They're there because the sovereign Lord brought them there, all right? And the fact that he brought them there means he wants you to share the gospel with them. And he'll give you every resource to do it. You look around, how are we going to do it? I don't know. Hey, I talked to a guy today who's looking at going to a church that's about dead, and he tell me, they don't have any resources, they don't have anything, but there's people all around there that need the gospel. And here's the truth. I mean this with all my heart, and I've experienced it, I've lived it. And it comes from Henry Blackaby. God is under no obligation to resource your plans for his church, and he probably won't. But he'll spare nothing from heaven to resource his plans for his church. So if you are willing to do what Jesus asked you to do, Jesus will find ways to resource everything you need in that church to do what he wants you to do.